everyone, and welcome to our webinar on teaching your students how to write persuasively. In this webinar, we will explore the following persuasive language techniques. I'd like you to take about 10 seconds to think about which of these techniques you might be familiar with and which of them you've used regularly in your teaching. So there's patterns of three. There's emotive expressions, rhetorical questions, logic and reason, and figurative language. There's tons more, but these are the ones that we will have time for in this webinar. We will explore the content, the techniques, style, and tone that you can help your students with. If you look at the text on the screen and think about how many techniques this introduction has used, that might help to clarify the use of each of the techniques listed on the screen. So there's reason, logic, there's evidence, there's rhetorical devices, emotive language, figurative expressions. So we've started with a rhetorical question, of course. Can you imagine a world without mobile phones? Not really looking for an answer, but it is meant to introduce the topic and provide a thought-provoking kickoff to the students. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to identify the other techniques that are listed in the text, and then perhaps we can go over this together and put your answers in the chat box if you can. Right, so it says currently 3 billion people in the world own smartphones. That, of course, is evidence that's provided from a study. Technology runs our lives like a ticking time bomb is figurative expression. And precisely, it is a simile, to be precise. And technology runs our lives might also be an example of personification. So there's a whole mix of figurative expressions used here. There's another one, lost in a sea of sadness, that's a metaphor. And it talks about friends who have their heads buried in screens. Okay, we will also consider perhaps the sea of sadness to be evoking pity for those who don't have mobile phones. And so it can classify as an emotive expression. The process and structure requires a lot of pre-work for students to understand the various ways in which these techniques can be used. So there's brainstorming involved. Sometimes it's helpful to let the students come up with their own questions to explore. So something like, if we could give them an example, such as, should schools give homework? Could you write a persuasive composition on whether schools should give homework to students? Or should students be required to wear uniforms while they're sitting down in front of the screen for an online lesson? Or should students be allowed mobile phones at school? Should parents restrict screen time at home? If we can just give them an example or two and then let them brainstorm with each other for ideas in pairs or in groups, or if you're teaching online, ask them to write their ideas in the chat box or just share them with you verbally. You could also use templates such as Padlet or an ideas board where all the students can write at the same time on the screen. So they don't really have to, it's a shared whiteboard. So students don't have to take turns and wait for the others to give their ideas and then interject. Interject because many times students like to all speak at the same time. We could also let them write at the same time, and that's much easier and faster as well. Help them frame their questions around the topic with the W technique. So there are 5 W's, the what, who, when, where, and why. And if they can frame questions starting with these W's, then they will actually be answering their own questions in their persuasive composition. You could also help students distinguish between facts and opinions. So the example given on the screen is pizza is the best food. That might be my opinion, but someone else might not agree with that. What is the difference between a fact and an opinion? A fact can't be argued with. For example, human beings need air to breathe, or human beings need air to live. Or you can frame it differently and say human beings need to breathe air to live. And then the next step in this is to have a peer exchange of written ideas. So once they've framed the questions around their chosen topic, they would then talk about their ideas, collect a pool of ideas, and then exchange their written ideas so that each of them has access to what their peers have also written. And then you can address key vocabulary. So what kind of language will make their writing more powerful or more concise or clearer? Those are things that you can help them with after the first draft is done. Now let's explore each of the techniques as we go along. What are rhetorical questions exactly used for? So the one we used right at the beginning of this session was meant to introduce a topic and provide a thought-provoking start to the composition. However, we can use this as a strong, powerful, persuasive technique to convince someone of just about anything, leading them to the answers that we want from them. So if I was someone who does not like broccoli at all, and you want to convince me to eat broccoli, you might say, do you want to be healthy? Now that's a rhetorical question because we already know the answer. No one will say no to that question. Or if you want to convince me to exercise regularly, you might want to ask, do you want to be fit? I won't say, no, I don't want to be fit. So rhetorical questions are meant to lead the listener or the participant to, or the reader, to the answers that you're looking for. There are also questions that are not meant to be answered really because the answer is self-evident. If you want to convince your teacher not to give homework, now that is after 2 examples, you might want to leave the students with the third to tackle on their own. And if you're the teacher, ask them, how would you convince me not to give you any homework? Can you come up with rhetorical questions for that? Here are some examples of rhetorical questions. So you've got a question like, what's not to like in that? You're not expecting an answer. You're challenging someone. So that's another function of a rhetorical question. You're emphasizing a point, or you're kind of rubbing a fact in and saying, what's not to like about this? Do you think you're actually looking for an answer there? No, you're just making a point. How did we discover space? Might be a good start to a factual or informative composition about space. When you read a question like that, you know what that question is leading to. You might identify the topic just by looking at the rhetorical question. How do we use rhetorical questions to embellish paragraphs? So we've got a few examples. Do you wish to be happy? And that might start off a discussion on what happiness actually is, or what do we actually need to do to make ourselves happy? Do you want to stay healthy? The point is to argue out our points and then add this as an icing on the cake. So you could end a paragraph with a rhetorical question as well, not just start your paragraph with a rhetorical question. Here it's meant to re-emphasize your point. The answers to rhetorical questions are self-evident. They're not expected. We don't actually want an answer to the questions we're asking. You can use them to emphasize a point, or you can use them for dramatic effect or for an impact. Here's another rhetorical device, exaggeration. And that works really well in persuasive writing because, again, that's meant for impact and dramatic effects. I could introduce my friends to you as lovely, wild, and brainless. Now, obviously, I don't wish to be perceived as a person who loves making friends with only brainless people. But I meant it when I wrote this sentence. I meant it as purposeful exaggeration for the sake of humor, and that kind of exaggeration hooks the reader and engages the reader, and they want to find out more about why I'm saying something that I am saying. Similarly, we have, I like three things in a dog: loyalty, brains, and craziness. That's a pattern of three. I'm using three different aspects of a dog, qualities of a dog. You could describe it as, if I say loyalty, that's a noun. If I say I like dogs to be loyal, brainy, and crazy, that would be three adjectives in a sentence. A pattern of three can come with three adjectives, adverbs, nouns, anything, different parts of speech. But a pattern of three is meant to provide precision, flow, and clarity to your writing. And you can ask the students to work with a partner and produce sentences with patterns of three that also have a bit of exaggeration thrown in to try it out. So experimentation is a very important part of writing. The more you experiment with writing, the braver you get with writing. It's kind of like swimming in cycling. You've got to experiment to know your own capacity to learn. And once you've learned, you want to perfect that technique, and your technique becomes better and better with practice. Writing is a kind of like a painstaking process that requires a bit of structure. And so we've got to let students learn the structure and then experiment with it as much as they can. For that, we would give them lots of hands-on practice. So let's say they're used to starting their story with once upon a time. We don't want them to do that. We want them to learn to experiment with inventive ideas. They could start with twice upon a time, or they could dive into the story without actually giving it a cliched start. They can start with something dramatic, like with a pattern of three on a cold, dreary winter morning. Or they could start with something like, it was dark and dusty. An abrupt start, but a mysterious start. It's important to spend tons of time just on the introduction, just the first sentence or the second sentence, teaching students to experiment with different ways of making their introduction or their start dramatic, or something that hooks the reader. So it has to be engaging. It has to be something that is promising. And so for that, they might need to dive into the topic right away, rather than start with, the dictionary defines this word as, now that might be a bit of a cliche. There should be a bit of shock value as well to the start, again, for impact and for dramatic effects. If they add evidence, reasons, examples, a bit of logic, that of course helps convince the reader that what they're talking about is backed or supported by experimentation or reason or research. And then they can use connectives to link their paragraphs. This has to be done very carefully and slowly as well, because many students get stuck sometimes on abrupt paragraphs that they are not able to link together so as to get a flow and fluency in their writing. And for that, we've got a very quick and simple process. We can teach them words, and this would require a bit of pre-work as well with vocabulary, to show them how to go through the firstly, and in the second paragraph they can have secondly, comma, or they can have looking closely at, comma, or they can start the second paragraph. If they are arguing against their own point of view, then they can Say, on the other hand, and show the flip side of the argument, all right, however, comma. Now, the reason why I've put a little cross on but is to discourage students from starting sentences with the word but, and it is slightly more formal and closer to standard English if we can ask them to avoid the but and write however, comma, instead. Here's an example of something we can help them structure in class. Should screen time be restricted for children? They could start with a reason after their introduction. Once you've taught them to hook the reader or engage the reader with a rhetorical question or a piece of evidence, a fact, or just a triple adjective sentence starting with a pattern of 3, you can go on to reason and logic to support their topic. Firstly, comma, and then after that, for the second point, secondly, comma, to present contrasts they could use on the other hand or however. Then we've got rhetorical questions that they can use anywhere in the composition. Doesn't have to be in their introduction, doesn't have to be in the middle paragraph or in the conclusion necessarily. They can literally come anywhere in the composition. Examples are really important to help the reader visualize or picture what the writer is meaning to say. How does emotive language work? Visuals work really well for students. So if you haven't tried that yet in your classrooms or online teaching, visuals will help spark off the process of brainstorming, especially if you have a screen available to you and you can put up pictures from the internet as often as possible. That will really help your students pick the facial expressions that they see and then use those to form adjectives to describe what they're looking at. So here, for example, we've got a really heartwarming visual with these innocent kittens. You could ask the students to describe the kittens and use emotive language to do so. Are they looking sad, helpless, powerless, innocent? Are they looking lost and confused? Are they hungry? Are they looking for food? Are they looking for their mom or their dad? And as I would say, visuals work really well for all ages. Of course, this is targeting primary students specifically. However, they use just as well, they work just as well for secondary students. There'll be different kinds of visuals. They would work just as well. Now let's explore a bit of figurative language and graphic prompts. Now I'd like you to think a bit about how you might have taught figurative language in the classroom. Here's a really nice structure from our new Oxford Modern English book. And it says, do you know these idioms? So just to familiarize students with how language can be manipulated and is multi-layered in a sense. So we can't take everything that we hear at face value. And as speakers and as writers, we can turn it around, we can twist language and give it a different meaning. We could say one thing overtly and mean another. So sometimes we have to scratch the surface to understand the deeper meaning of expressions. Here's one, in the wink of an eye. What might that mean? We've got the meaning here very quickly. Then it gives you an example. The fox stood on the road for a while, dazed by a car's headlight, then disappeared back into the jungle. All this happened in the wink of an eye. So there's the meaning given to you, the example given to you, and then you might ask the students to use this example and come up with their own sentence. What else do you do in the wink of an eye? Someone would say, I got out of bed this morning in the wink of an eye. I can finish a slice of chocolate cake in the wink of an eye. And so it would go on and on and on until everyone has had their turn to talk about what they can do in the wink of an eye. It's important to link it to their own personal experience, because when they can talk about themselves in that context, you're not only contextualizing it, you're helping your students connect with that figurative expression and internalize it and process it. And that is where they get the confidence to use the figurative language and not find it daunting. Here's a game you can play in the classroom. It's a really fun activity. So once they've learned the patterns of three, once they've learned how to use rhetorical questions in persuasive writing, figurative language, and they have also learned how to use emotive language, what we can then do is have 4 corners, and we can label these 4 corners: patterns of three, rhetorical questions, figurative language, and emotive language. You can have your students in a classroom sitting at their desks, and you would then on the screen have a sentence coming on, or you can say it verbally to them as well. They've got to get up and run to the corner where it belongs. So can you imagine a world without technology? It would be a rhetorical question. They would get up and run to the corner that is labeled rhetorical question. They can do this in pairs, or they can do this individually. It's a lot of fun to familiarize students this way using embodied learning in a primary school classroom. For secondary students, you can have cue cards. And so they've got to, and you can perhaps give them many more. For primary school students, it might need to be a shorter activity, and you might want to stop at 5 or 6 sentences like that. But in your secondary classroom, especially during online teaching, you can write down about 50 to 60 sentences like that and give them these 4 cards to separate the sentences in. And they can do that as an individual activity or in the chat box with you during online classes. So that is the gist of what persuasive writing techniques are and how they can be used in the classroom. And again, the more children experiment with these techniques, the better they become at using them. A few don'ts. I would normally ask students not to hold themselves back. So if they are to become confident and brave writers, they've got to experiment with expressions that they are not always familiar with, and vocabulary that they might not use in conversation, but they might want to experiment with bringing it in, weaving it into their composition to see if it works or doesn't. And you might want to encourage them to reread what they've written, so they don't stop at the first draft. They learn to edit it, read it to themselves out loud, and figure out where they're repeating themselves, because that might make their writing a bit boring. And then, of course, you want to encourage them to avoid generalization or stereotypes and go with something that is more individualistic and unique in its approach. For that, they will give concrete examples. So they wouldn't just say, you know, everyone in the world loves fish just because they love fish. They cannot generalize. What is it that they're using? What kind of piece of evidence do they have? What research are they using to make that point? You might want to challenge them and question them sometimes. So their facts can become more rigorous, and so they can learn to defend their opinion when they write. Good luck with that. Thank you very much for being here. Hope you all enjoyed that.